Hello and welcome back. I guess good morning, good afternoon, or good evening, depending on where in the world you're joining from. We're just coming off of a lunch break here on the East Coast, and I am about to be joined by Dana Epp with Vulscan. And Dana's going to talk to us about a topic that we touched on in a couple of our earlier sessions this morning in API security fundamentals. Now we're kind of shifting into the future of API security. And one of the things that has come up consistently and that I know is a big challenge for a lot of organizations and a lot of security professionals is this, undocumented APIs. So Dana Epp, again from Vulscan, is joining us, and his talk is focused on reverse engineering undocumented APIs. Welcome, Dana, and I'm really excited to hear this talk because this is a huge challenge in securing APIs, right? Is just this notion of how many undocumented and unmanaged APIs are out there. So
yeah, absolutely. As we move this world now, they're saying over 80% of all traffic on the internet is driven by APIs, yet far less of them are actually understood or known. And so what we're going to do today is hopefully by the end of this talk, everyone who's listening will be empowered to be able to look at how to find APIs and then figure out how to create your own documentation for it, because you can't trust the docs that are out there. So
great. Well, I'm looking forward to the talk.
Awesome.
Take it away.
All right. So we'll get our slide deck loaded up here. Excellent. So here we go. So today we're going to talk about how to reverse engineer an undocumented API, but it might help if we kind of set the stage by helping you understand who I am and why I can talk about this. And so I've been a builder and a breaker of software for over 30 years now. I've been awarded the designation by Microsoft as an enterprise security and developer security MVP for over 18 years now. I'm also a director of OWASP Vancouver. So I spend a lot of time thinking about applications and the web and how we go about securing it. And the way that I like to do that is through a lot of different engagements, especially when it comes to thinking about how to look at it from an attacker's perspective. So outside of the work that I do as a security engineer and as a security researcher, I also run the popular API Hacker Inner Circle newsletter, where we're talking about this kind of stuff for developers and testers and hackers who want to level up their API hacking skills. So anything you learned today, if you want to learn more, just go to apihacker.blog and sign up. It's absolutely free. And if you're into that kind of stuff, hey, that's great. You're my kind of people. Because my belief is that AppSec via OPSEC will always help us to try to find the things that aren't being thought about. So when we're thinking about building APIs out there, we're always thinking about how to test them and how they function. But from an offensive security engineering perspective, we're looking at the realistic way of how would we go about security testing it by making a software work in ways it's not supposed to. So even if we had good API documentation, it doesn't matter, because we're trying to figure out how the application actually is going to function and, how is it not supposed to function. And these are the type of things that are very important to, at least for me, which is why I'm into it. So why are we here today, right? Like that's really the crutch of what are we trying to accomplish? Well, Salt Security has this really interesting report that I encourage you to go check out at salt.security/API security trends. URL's at the bottom right there. But here's one of the interesting stats that came out of their research report that I thought was really cool. 48% of API publishers update their docs less than twice a year. So let's think about that for a second. Half of the APIs out there are only getting updated docs twice a year. But the reality is 83% of them do report that they're updating those APIs more frequently than that. As we continue to shift left to deliver more functionality in our applications and be more agile in API development, that means that they're working way faster in producing the APIs and far slower in producing the documentation for those APIs. And that's a real problem. Even though there are solutions out there that can solve that by, documentation as code and being able to generate in your CI/CD pipeline the clear docs from the work being done, it's not being built that way. And that means that we have a real problem. Think about that for a second. It means half of the APIs out there on the internet aren't even properly documented. They're containing code that people may not know exist or understand how they work. which means as an API hacker, this is very exciting because it means there's tons of attack surface available to us to be able to test and find how these APIs may function in ways they're not supposed to. And as I mentioned earlier, Cloudflare has been talking about the fact that over 83% of the traffic they're seeing is driven by APIs. This is a real problem. So now when I'm talking about what is API documentation, I just want to be very clear what we're talking about here. So when I'm thinking about a lot of APIs, there's obviously tons of different kinds that are out there, but I'm really wanting to focus on mostly those REST APIs, right? So you've probably heard of things like Swagger and the idea of being able to document and demonstrate what endpoints are doing. And that's kind of what I'm getting at here is I want to talk about OpenAPI, right? That's the specification of the API that's explaining what's on there. And Swagger, that used to be the format, what we talk about, but now it's kind of changed, right? So OpenAPI is the specification documentation, and Swagger is the tooling. And that means that you can build OpenAPI docs without Swagger, without those tools. And we're going to showcase how to do that today and how to be able to produce your own rogue API docs when the docs that are there may be old or obsolete, or maybe they don't even exist, especially for a lot of admin endpoints where maybe the web apps that you're testing or validating, they have clear documentation from a user consumption perspective, but maybe those admin APIs aren't that way. Great examples looking at something like the Azure portal from Microsoft. They provide tons of documentation on how the user functions, but the actual portal and how it actually runs things behind the scenes, that's not documented at all. However, if you know how to generate your own undocumented rogue APIs, you'll be able to get all the information from these APIs that are not generally available to you so that you can actually look deeper into how things function. So the other thing I want to make sure we're talking about is that, are these API docs just for developers? Are we only focusing on developer-focused docs? And my answer is to this, no, absolutely not. API docs are not just meant for developers who are consuming the resources, but also for the people that have to test it, right? Not just security testing, but also just basic functional testing that's on there and understanding how data flows in and out of these systems. But it's also for things like OPSEC, right? The operations security group and the SOC need to know how these APIs are function so that they can better protect them in production, especially if we start trying to implement, edge security measures in this stuff, everything from your API gateways and WAFs to your monitoring tools that have to look through all this stuff. They need to understand what these APIs are doing. And sometimes it's really good to generate your own API docs to audit what's going on. So why craft our own? So I've already talked about part of it, which is just the whole aspect of how half the time the docs aren't up to date anyways. But the other reason is that we need to understand how the API actually works, not how the developer documented it to work. And that's a critical component, especially when we're talking about API security testing, because we need to try to understand and see how is the API actually functioning under certain conditions. From a security perspective, we're not caring as much about, is the API working as intended? What we want to understand is, how can we make the API work in ways not intended? Because it's those cases where we start to be able to find the vulnerabilities that can be really impactful. Because APIs are developer-centric first, and the aspect of we're thinking about it from an object perspective, a lot of times what we typically see in web applications, which may be driven and filtered at the client level, APIs aren't. And because developers are looking at it from an object perspective, it means that we're moving far more sensitive data in interesting ways. And we want to be able to look at how it actually is functioning, not how the docs were written. The other side of it is that we can track the API lifecycle of a target better, because many times when documentation is updated, for things like small updates and changes, they're not updated. But if we know something changes, like the schema of the object, something gets added or removed, and it's not properly versioned, you may not be able to see that directly. But if we have the ability to create our own API docs, then we're able to monitor that better, to be able to track the API lifecycle much closer. And from a hacker perspective, this is really good because we can start looking for signals of change as they're happening. And if there hasn't been proper change engineering in place, it means that we're exposing new attack surfaces in areas that haven't been expected. Because maybe a developer was just making a quick change because of something going on, and then now it exposes that API endpoint to more risk that may not have been normally noticed or understood simply by looking at a documentation change. So I'm going to show you how to do that right now. So I'm going to show you a real world way of doing this, because we can talk about trying to understanding the docs by looking at it through code. We can take a look at it from what's being published on ours, but I really want to talk about how I would go about doing something like this, because it is a slightly different. I'm an AppSec person, so I focus on the application security on there, but I work with network security pen testers all the time. And we always have to be able to work together. And it's a very important component to that, because where the network pen testers will go in, they'll be taking a look at how do the hosts are functioning, what is the network looking like, where the servers dedicated. At some point, they're going to get on and get footholds into these systems. And we're going to want to leverage that to be able to collect the traffic to the apps that are running on there. So as an example, maybe during a pen test, the network pen testers got into a network, they were able to get onto a workstation. And now on that workstation, they want to see what kind of application usage is happening so that we can track what APIs are exposed, so we can look at how they're going to interact. At that point of the app communicating, we want to be able to track that information. So being able to look at things at the network level is not going to help us, because they're always going to be inside of, typically through an SSL tunnel or some sort of mechanism like that. So we need to get closer. So we're going to need to do it by either proxying directly in the app, which isn't always practical when we're looking at it from a pen testing perspective, because we may not have the ability to change behaviors on that workstation. So there's a better way or a different way that you can do this by just using the tools that are right on the system directly. So I'm going to walk you through how to do that right now. So the first thing we want to do is capture that traffic, and we're going to do it directly through the browser. No special proxies, no other extra things. What we're going to do is go into the dev tools. And in the dev tools, we have the ability to go over to the networking tab. And if you go into that networking tab, there's these two checkboxes, and you'll see this in Edge, on Internet Explorer, in Chrome, in Firefox, and even in Safari. So depending on what platform you're on, you'll be able to get into some sort of network traffic container. And in there, there'll be an option to preserve the logs, which you want to check, and to disable cache. And these are important, because what we want to be able to do is preserve the logs between communications on pages. So if we don't have a single page application and we have something that's posting all the time, we don't want to destroy the traffic. We want to preserve it through the logging. So we're going to turn that on, and then we're just going to simply hit record. And what that will allow us to do is start tracking what is happening in that browser session. As it's going on, we want to start using that web application. And as it's flowing, any place where that web app is calling into an API, we're going to start collecting that traffic information directly through the browser. Nothing special. But what's nice about that is it's going to track everything. It's going to track the requests and the responses. It's going to collect all the information that relates to the session data that is transpiring as everything's going on. And we're going to use that information so we can weaponize that data later. Okay? When I say I want you to use the web app as normal, I want you to be very clear. We want to expose everything that calls into these APIs. So you want to obviously use those, try to expose those user functions. You want to try every single feature and function belonging to what that user session will do. But I also want you to think beyond that. I want you to think about, is there a way for you to get into an admin context? Is that through a separate account, through privilege? There's some other way that we can see how it would, in that tenant, however that application functions, are there different privilege levels? You want to be able to see that so that we can expose potentially other endpoints that you would not normally see. The other side to that too is, depending on what kind of web application and API you're testing, look at the premium features, which you may not normally see. Because when we look at third parties that might be looking at testing it, so maybe this is actual third-party pen test services, maybe this is bug bounty programs, whatever they may be out there, when there are premium features, they don't get as much traction. Mostly because they usually cost extra money, so people don't want to invest in those, or they're much harder to get access to because there's more complexity and setup and management because they're premium features. Those are the premium ones that you want to be looking at, because those are awesome for finding opportunities for a larger attack surface, because its functionality is not as tested as much. So you're testing those user functions, you're testing those admin functions, you're looking at those premium functions, and you're collecting as much information as you can. Okay, so once you've done that, you've tested everything in that app, it's called out to the API as much as possible. Now we have all this data. Now we have to extract it out of the browser. And what's nice about that is we can just go do that by just clicking download and export to HAR, or an HTTP archive. A HAR is just a JSON formatted file that will have all of that information that we collected, all of the requests and the responses, the session data, the information about the endpoints, all collected into a single structured format that we can then leverage. And once we have that HAR, we can take it offline. So this is when I was talking about how, partnering with our network pen testers, we can have them go in there, set this stuff up, collect all that information on all those different hosts, export the HARs, and now all of a sudden we're seeing all the different user data from all the different ways that people are accessing applications on these different systems. And now we have them, and we can take that offline and then use that to generate our own API docs. So with our HAR in hand, what we then do is we run a tool called Man-in-the-Middle Proxy to Swagger. This is a free tool you can get off the internet that gives you the capability of taking HAR files and converting them into an OpenAPI definition file. So the way that we work this is, you can see the command that's right there. We go man-in-the-middle proxy to Swagger -I for the input. What is this HAR file, or what is this data? So in this example here, I was collecting, crappy.api sec.ai, the traffic that was there, and I'm going to output that into a YAML file, which will be used as part of the OpenAPI Spec doc. So it'll create this crappy.yaml file. The -P there is with a prefix. So when you're setting up and trying to set up your API documentation, it's usually going to be URL centric, but it doesn't have to be. Whatever that prefix may be that relates to the API, you'll have it there. So in this case, this would be to the endpoint we were accessing there. The -E gives you the ability to say, do you wish to also include the examples? So what ends up happening is, because we have the live data, when we're populating the OpenAPI doc spec, we can actually put examples directly in there, which means that we're generating this JSON schema objects for each endpoint based on the actual real data that transpired during our recording session during recon. So we're able to then take that information, and the -F just tells man-in-the-middle proxy to Swagger that we're going to use a file type of HAR, because you can actually use actual proxy data files as well. But this is a clean way of being able to extract it directly through the browser using that HAR file. So once we generate that HAR, take that HAR, we're going to generate this YAML file. It's not actually an OpenAPI doc yet. At this point, what we have is we have this scaffolding for a definition file. So if we take a look here, you open up in your favorite text editor. I just open up in VS Code here. But what you can start seeing is a structure that's similar to what an OpenAPI spec doc looks like. But you'll see there's a ton of these ignore endpoints. So every path request that was made during that recon, it's going to store it in there. You just remove anything that has ignore : for any endpoint that you believe is a true endpoint that you want to add to your documentation. So in this example here, you can see I've already exposed the community module and the identity module and the endpoints related to the traffic session that I had on there. And once we've edited that YAML file and we've got a place of all the information we want, we're ready to go. We can take that information, save it out, and then just rerun that man-in-the-middle proxy to Swagger one more time. And what this will now do is it'll read that YAML file that's now there. It will see what you're saying you don't want to ignore, and it'll use that information to generate your actual final OpenAPI spec docs. And what ends up happening, you see something like this. Similar file, but now we're actually got all the true paths and information that we want. So we can see all the posts and puts and gets. We can see the responses that are in there. And now we have everything we need from a documentation perspective. And we can actually take that over to editor.swagger.io, and we can actually look through it. And we can actually use that as a REST client if we wanted to. Right then and there, we have the ability. You can see as an example here, example schemas for this login endpoint, what is needed in the request. And hey, we can even see what happens, what comes back in the response. If you don't want to have live data in this document, you just ignore the -E option, and then it won't put that data in there. But I encourage you to actually have that data in there, because then it helps you to see what the schema looks like and what actually transpired during your recon session. Of course, now that we have the OpenAPI doc, what do we do with it? Well, first thing is we can import it into Postman. So we can take that YAML file, bring it right in. It'll create a collection directly in Postman. And now we have a REST client. What's even better, though, is it's pre-populated with all of that example data from the live session, so that we can then utilize that to replay and rerun everything that we want. but I don't want you to end there. Remember, we're doing API security testing, and we want to be able to weaponize this data and start using it to attack those APIs. So what I want you to do is to take that Postman, I want you to reconfigure it to proxy through Burp Suite. And now by using a custom proxy configuration, we have our REST client, but we also have the ability to manipulate and manage this directly in a tool designed for weaponizing this data. And this is where we start using Burp Suite. We can now send a request from Postman, and then we'll capture it in Burp Suite, send it to repeater and intruder tabs, which gives us the ability to attack those APIs directly in the system. And that's it. It's not that hard. So if we think about it, how do we generate and use rogue API docs? Well, we start with the browser dev tools to get a hard capture. Once you have that hard capture, you're going to take man-in-the-middle proxy to Swagger. You're going to generate a YAML file. You're going to take that YAML file, edit it with your favorite text editor like VS Code or Vi or whatever you have. And then you're going to rerun the man-in-the-middle proxy to Swagger to generate true OpenAPI spec docs based on actual traffic that's live from the APIs you're testing. You'll import those directly into Postman and you have your REST client. And you'll be able to use that directly, but go one step further, proxy Postman through Burp Suite, and now you can attack those APIs directly through Burp Suite. Now, here's the thing. We don't simply write API docs. We want to generate these, and we want to make sure that we're generating this for all the traffic. So if you don't want to do this throughout the entire application, focus on the modules that you're testing. Focus specifically in those areas, generate the real traffic from it, and then separate them. Nothing says we can't have separate files. What's nice about that, though, is that we can then use this for advanced recon, because now we can then start doing things like doing delta diffs. We could take these OpenAPI docs that are generated between sessions and look for differences. And it's in those differences that we'll start to find areas that are probably not documented at all or that are poorly documented, which gives us an opportunity to take advantage of it from a hacker's perspective to test these APIs in areas that probably aren't getting as much visibility in the QA side of things. And that's the fun part of it all. I see we're coming up to our 20-minute mark now, which is great because we're right getting to a point where I'd love to take some questions that are on there. I want to remind you, though, that if this kind of stuff is interesting to you and you like the idea of offensive security engineering when coming to testing out APIs, make sure you head over to apihacker.blog, sign up for that free newsletter so you can be kept up to date every single week on interesting different ways at looking at testing your APIs. With that said, I'm open for any kind of Q&A if anyone's got any questions.
We do have one question that came through, Dana, and thank you for that session. That was a great hands-on tutorial, really succinct and very informative, so appreciate it. And again, I know we had a little bit of issues with the video stream at the very beginning of Dana's session. All of these sessions will be up on the apidays YouTube channel. It's at apidays, and you can find that easily on YouTube. Everything will be up in the next couple of days. So if you missed anything, I know we went a little bit fast, but if you missed anything, go back out and catch it there. You can probably also catch a lot of that information, I would imagine, on the blog that you mentioned, Dana, right?
Absolutely. Yeah. So if you head over to danaepp.com/blog, there is an article that's based on this type of research for generating your own rogue API docs. So there's some more information there, goes into a little more detail for that kind of thing.
Great. So the question that we had was, what tools do you recommend to tie API docs with other web or UI documentation that may already exist?
So the question is, what sort of tools used for API documentation can be used for other web documentation?
Yeah, or how can you tie maybe the two of them together? Is there value in pulling in web documentation or UI documentation into, I guess, these API docs that you're creating?
Yeah, so being that most APIs are developer first, I think one of the interesting things about things like OpenAPI spec docs is that they themselves are documentation. Yeah. And depending on how APIs are written and how you generate out this information, they themselves become self-documenting. So if you take one of these YAML files to like editor.swagger.io, that's a free service that SmartBear software makes available. You can import that YAML file directly in there, and it will show you then a full document tree of all the requests and the responses that are expected there and what those schemas look like. It even breaks it down by the endpoint and the verb. So if it's a post, put, a get, etc. And it also will provide information about the schemas themselves. So that becomes quite valuable when looking at it from how can I consume those services. And that's what I would usually recommend is people utilize that. Now, there are people that take those Swagger type files and then publish them in their own format and structure. And there's nothing wrong with that. And I've seen people, especially in like Confluence and whatnot, to convert that into like their own wikis and whatnot. But most tooling will consume an OpenAPI spec doc. And I encourage people to use that as their documentation, because then it is much clearer and it's concise and everyone can consume that in whatever tool they want to use.
So again, I just want to say thank you for the talk, Dana, but also thank you for all that you do to support the community and for that rich community that you have and the blog out there. If you missed it, I'll drop it back in the chat for this session so that everybody can go follow that URL and sign up for the blog and join the community. But thank you again for the talk. This is fantastic.
Awesome. Thank you very much.